knowledge of the Far East. I was dragged out of bed to write the backgrounder on Tokyo on the night of our first long-range bomber attack in 1944, for which no one had prepared. I wrote the backgrounders on the East China coast for the landing that never came, and on the Soviet Far East for the Russian entry against Japan that came only 5 days before the end. For some weeks I even took over the Indochina desk in the absence of its normal occupant, because, on the strength of a research paper I had once done for the IPR, I was the only person in the office who could say without hesitating, Laos, Cambodia, Cochin China, Tonkin, Annam, the 5 states of Indochina. No one then had ever heard of Vietnam. For a while I also covered the Burma campaign in acrimonious rivalry with the military desk, which considered Burma their turf, while we at FE considered it ours. It was in the course of defending this territory that I followed the exploits of and became interested in General Stilwell. During the next 20 years the interest receded, but remained a flickering ember that never died. Meanwhile, the restoration of the State of Israel after a gap of nearly 2,000 years struck me as an event unique in history and started me on my first book, Bible and Sword. Ending with the Balfour Declaration of 1918, this led me to the Zimmermann Telegram of 1917, which in turn led back to 1914 and the Guns of August, and that in turn to the social origins of the Great War in the Proud Tower. By the time that book was published, it was 1966. The American relation to Asia was now an importunate reality. No one needed to wash Buddhas to get it into the press. Stilwell revived in my mind from a combination of reasons. Because it offered what I had long been looking for, an important body of unpublished papers to work from. Because his career made an ideal focus for a book on the American relation to China, and because, when I discussed the subject with my eldest daughter and son-in-law, 2 highly educated, cosmopolitan young people, I was struck by the fact that they knew nothing about America's past connection with China, but wanted to know. When I proposed an alternative subject that I had in mind at the time, they insisted that I must do the book on China, so I did. I first approached the Stilwell family for access to the papers in March 1967. Stilwell in the American Experience in China, 1911-1945, was published in February 1971, 2 months before China opened its doors to the American ping-pong team, with Henry Kissinger not far behind. I can hardly claim to have foreseen this turn of events, much less its fortunate coincidence for my book. But when people ask, how did I happen to choose China, I like to suggest that if a historian understands the past, he will have acquired in the process a feel of the future. China was closed to Americans during the time I was writing the book, but though it was now too late for that purpose, I applied for a visa out of the intense interest my task had aroused in me. In June 1972, I received word that I was invited to visit China. The journey was made in company with my youngest daughter, Alma, over a period of 6 weeks in July and August. Barbara Tuchman, 1972. In the 8 years since these reports were written, many changes, both political and social, have taken place in China, and many thousands of Americans have visited the People's Republic and learned for themselves something of the people and the country. I should like to ask readers of this reissue to keep in mind that notes 1 to 9, while, I hope, valid for their time, represent reports by one of the first generation of American visitors after the long break in relations, and necessarily dealt with basics, which are now widely familiar. Barbara Tuchman, June 1980. Chapter 1. Standing Up. In a country where misery and want were the foundation of the social structure, famine was periodic, death from starvation common, disease pervasive, thievery normal, and graft and corruption taken for granted, the elimination of these conditions in communist China is so striking that negative aspects of the new rule fade in relative importance. The dominant fact is that for China's working class, which is to say over 80% of the world's most populous country, the lid of exploitation has been lifted. While visible betterment varies widely between the major cities and the provinces, it is probably true to say of all areas that the working class, in whose interest China is now governed, have found a sense of purpose, self-confidence, and dignity in the knowledge that they are the object of the state's concern, not, as in the past, society's victims. The most obvious negative in the process is the mental monotone imposed upon the country. All thought, all ideas, past, present, and future, not to mention the historic record, are twisted, manipulated, rolled out, and flattened into one, expressed in half a dozen slogans dinned incessantly and insistently into the heads of the public. As far as the life of the mind in China is concerned, its scope has rigid limits, and its sound is a blaring, endlessly repeated single note with effect, at least upon a Westerner, like the drip, drip, drip on the victim's head of the ancient Chinese water torture, if it had made a loud noise. The message is that the people are the motive force, that Marxism, Leninism is universal truth, and that propelled by its principles and Chairman Mao's thought, China's working class can ultimately build socialism, meaning well-being for everyone. The goal lies ahead and can only be reached by keeping the revolution green, that is, by continually renewed contact with the masses. Domestically, it seems to work. I say seems throughout these notes cautiously and advisedly, because ignorance of the language is a barrier equal to being deaf. A 6-week visitor under this handicap can offer conclusions as impressions only. Perhaps, too, the transfer to collectivism has been made easier because China's life was in some ways collective to begin with. Consider the Kang, the built-in wall-to-wall bed of North China, on which, in the poorer homes, the whole family sleeps. With that in their background, collective adjustment is natural, not to say imperative. In any event, from what we could see through 11 cities, Peking, Taiwan, Yan'an, Xi'an, Luoyang, Chengchao, Wuhan, Nanking, Suzhou, Shanghai, and Canton, and a variety of rural settlements, collective effort has made up China's oldest lack, enough food. Our reception at an agricultural commune in central Shanxi included 3 or 4 heaping platters each of sliced tomatoes, fresh peaches, and sweetened stuffed dumplings made of glutinous rice, a substance to make a Western stomach quail, in far greater abundance than was required by the company. Admittedly, this was laid on to impress the visitors, as was everything else we met in China, but the availability of such abundance to agricultural workers and their unhungry attitude toward it were simply not possible in the past, when, as one member of the commune said, the lower peasants could not even have the chaff of the rice to eat. Increased production, materially speaking, is what China's revolution is all about. It refutes all the firm statements of economists and agronomists in the past that China's arable land could not be augmented, nor the yield per unit of land be raised sufficiently to feed the expanding population. Both have been done, not by magic, but because the people have been mobilized and motivated to do it, by expropriation and redistribution of land, permitting communal farming in large tracts instead of fractional plots, and by the knowledge that everything they do to make improvements will now benefit themselves, not the landlord. I will cite no statistics on increased yield, because I cannot judge their reliability. But in this summer's drought in North China, with day after relentless day of no rain and of temperatures over 100, when one sees fresh water being pumped in life-giving gushes from irrigation channels, and sees surrounding fields green, vegetables ripening, and seedling crops sprouting instead of withering, one needs no statistics. In the old days, this year's drought would have been lethal. The great Miyun Dam and Reservoir northeast of Peking, the pumping stations and sedimentation plants along the Yellow River that have at last harnessed China's sorrow, and similar projects constructed elsewhere under the new regime, besides providing hydroelectric power, have brought drought, flood, and famine under control. The result provides the agricultural surplus, which, paid in kind to the state as a form of tax, supplies the capital for expansion of industry, the other of the 2 legs on which the new China walks. In human terms, the process has produced a new person, the worker from the ranks who can become manager of the enterprise.